I learned sign languages as a kid for fun. It's the only reason my family is still alive. Everyone thought I was wasting my life learning sign languages. They were wrong, but I didn't know that until I watched 3 armed men break into my parents' cabin through the security camera and realized I was the only person who could warn my family without making a sound. My name is Adrian Wolf, and for 23 years, people told me my obsession with sign languages was pointless. Teachers said I should focus on real subjects. My ex-girlfriend left me because I spent more time practicing hand shapes than holding hers. Even my own sister called it a party trick that would never matter in the real world. But last November, that party trick became the only thing standing between my family and 3 men who'd come to kill us. I'm getting ahead of myself, though, because the story actually starts when I was 8 years old and stumbled across a documentary about deaf culture that changed everything. Not just American Sign Language, but the whole world of visual languages that most hearing people never even know exist. I became obsessed in the way only a lonely kid can become obsessed with something. I taught myself ASL first, then British Sign Language, Australian Sign Language, International Sign, even Japanese Sign Language from grainy videos I found in the darkest corners of the internet. By the time I was 15, I could hold conversations in 6 different sign languages, and I was learning the subtle regional dialects that made each one unique. My younger brother Isaac thought it was cool at first, would ask me to teach him swear words in ASL that he could use at school without teachers knowing. But even he lost interest after a few months and went back to football and normal teenage things. My older sister Melanie was less kind about it. She told me once at a family dinner that I was hiding behind my hands because I was too scared to actually speak and be heard. That comment stuck with me for years, probably because part of me worried she was right. By 31, I was still practicing every single day. I'd wake up and run through finger-spelling drills while my coffee brewed. I'd watch international news with the sound off and practice signing the stories I saw. I'd built this entire life around languages that 99% of the population would never use or understand, and I couldn't really explain why, except that it felt like solving an infinite puzzle where every conversation taught me something new. My parents had stopped asking when I'd get a real career. I worked as a freelance graphic designer, made enough to pay my bills, and spent my free time in online signing communities where I was actually respected for my skills. Last November, my mom called and said the whole family was meeting at their cabin in the Cascade Mountains for Thanksgiving week. She said it in that tone that meant attendance wasn't optional, that this was about family unity and making memories, and I needed to show up even though I'd rather stay home with my laptop and practice the new regional ASL variants I'd been studying. The cabin was 40 minutes from the nearest town on a dirt road that barely counted as maintained. My parents had bought it 15 years ago, and my dad had spent countless weekends turning it from a hunting shack into something almost livable. It had 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that smelled like pine and propane, and absolutely no cell phone signal for miles. My dad always said that was a feature, not a bug, that we needed to disconnect from technology and reconnect with each other. I'd argued that we lived in 2023, and being unreachable for a week was dangerous, but he'd waved me off and said people survived for thousands of years without cell phones. I drove up on Monday afternoon, 3 days before Thanksgiving, because my mom had asked me to come early and help prepare. The road was already icing over in patches, and I could see dark clouds building over the mountains that promised snow. My car barely made it up the final hill, tires spinning on frozen mud, and when I finally parked next to the cabin, I sat there for a minute wondering why I'd agreed to this. Isaac and his fiancée Natasha arrived an hour after me, pulling up in his truck with enough supplies to survive a month instead of a week. Natasha was nice enough, a dental hygienist from Spokane who smiled too much and called everyone Han in a way that felt forced. Isaac looked happy though, happier than I'd seen him in years, and I tried to be genuinely glad for him, even though part of me was jealous that he'd figured out how to build a normal life while I was still playing with hand gestures in my spare time. Melanie showed up Wednesday morning with her husband Douglas and their 2 kids, Lily, who was 9, and Owen, who was 7. The kids were loud and energetic in the way that made me immediately anxious about spending a week in close quarters with them, but Melanie seemed stressed in a way that went beyond normal parent exhaustion. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and she kept checking her phone even though there was no signal, like she was expecting a call that couldn't possibly come through. That first night we all sat around the fireplace, and my dad made his traditional speech about gratitude and family bonds, and how lucky we were to have this time together. Everyone nodded and smiled, and I caught Melanie and Douglas exchanging a look that I couldn't quite read. Something was off about them, a tension that felt like more than just the usual married couple stress. I signed to Isaac in ASL, asking if he'd noticed anything weird about Melanie, and he signed back that she'd been distant for months, that Douglas had some kind of work trouble, but nobody would talk about details. My parents didn't notice our conversation because they'd never bothered learning to sign, which meant Isaac and I had been having silent discussions right in front of them for decades. After everyone went to bed, I stayed up late in the living room practicing some new international sign vocabulary I'd been working on, moving my hands through the patterns until the muscle memory felt natural. I was the only one still awake at 2 in the morning when I heard the sound. Not loud, just wrong. A scraping noise from the back of the cabin that didn't match the wind or the settling of old wood. I stood up and walked quietly to the window, moving the curtain aside just enough to look out into the darkness. At first I didn't see anything except trees and shadows and the faint reflection of moonlight on snow. Then movement, 3 figures in dark clothing approaching the cabin from the tree line. They were moving carefully, coordinated, like people who'd done this before. My heart started hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat because this wasn't random. Random burglars don't hike 40 minutes through frozen forest in the middle of the night to rob a cabin. These men knew we were here, and they'd come for a specific reason. I watched them split up, 2 heading toward the back door and 1 circling toward the front, and I realized with absolute clarity that I had maybe 60 seconds before they breached the cabin, and I needed to warn my family without making a single sound that would alert the intruders that we knew they were coming. My phone was useless without signal. Yelling would give away our advantage and might trigger immediate violence. Running to wake everyone individually would take too long and create noise, but I could sign. I could move through this cabin in complete silence and use the one skill that everyone had told me was worthless, to communicate danger without making a sound. I ran to my parents' bedroom first, moving on the balls of my feet to minimize creaking floorboards, and shook my dad awake. He started to speak, and I clamped my hand over his mouth, then signed in ASL right in front of his face, even though he didn't understand the language. But he understood my expression and the urgency in my movements, and he nodded to show he'd stay quiet. I pulled out my phone and typed quickly, 3 armed men outside. Don't make noise. Get mom. Meet me in basement. He read it, and his face went white, but he didn't make a sound as he turned to wake my mother. I moved to Isaac's room next, and found him tangled in blankets with Natasha sleeping beside him. I shook Isaac hard, and when his eyes opened, I was already signing in ASL. Danger. Men with guns. Silent. Basement. Now. Isaac had retained enough sign language from our childhood to understand basic concepts, and the fear in my face filled in what his limited vocabulary couldn't. He signed back. How many? I signed. 3. Maybe more. Move quiet. He nodded and started waking Natasha without speaking, covering her mouth when she started to ask questions, typing on his phone to explain. I went to Melanie's room last and found her already awake, sitting up in bed with Douglas beside her, and the look on her face told me something I hadn't known before. She wasn't surprised. She was terrified, but not surprised. And when I started signing that men were outside, she interrupted me with her own frantic signing that I barely recognized as ASL because her vocabulary was so limited. But I understood enough to know she was saying, "I'm sorry," over and over, and suddenly I knew this wasn't random at all. Whatever was happening had something to do with her, with Douglas, with some situation they'd brought to our family without warning anyone. I didn't have time to be angry because I could hear the back door handle rattling as someone tested whether it was locked. I gestured frantically for Melanie and Douglas to get the kids and move to the basement, and I signed to Douglas, who I'd never seen use sign language before. Quiet, or we die. He nodded and started gathering Lily and Owen from their sleeping bags on the floor, putting his hand over Lily's mouth before she could ask questions, showing Owen his phone screen where he'd typed, "Game, complete silence." My dad appeared in the hallway with my mom, both of them moving carefully, and I directed everyone toward the basement stairs at the back of the cabin. The basement was unfinished, mostly just foundation and storage, but it had a root cellar that my dad had built into the hillside that might hide us if we could get there before the intruders came inside. We were halfway down the stairs when I heard glass breaking in the kitchen. They were inside. The root cellar was maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, carved into the earth behind the basement with a heavy wooden door that looked like part of the wall if you didn't know it was there. I got everyone inside and pulled the door closed behind us, and we stood there in complete darkness, barely breathing, while I heard footsteps above us, heavy boots on the kitchen floor, moving methodically through the cabin, checking rooms. Someone said something I couldn't make out, and another voice responded in what sounded like Russian, or maybe Ukrainian. My mom was shaking beside me, and I felt her start to cry, but she kept it silent, just tears running down her face that I could feel when my arm brushed against hers. My phone's brightness was turned all the way down, but I used it to type messages that I held up for everyone to read. Stay absolutely silent. They're searching the house. If they find the basement, they might not find this cellar. No noise means no location. Everyone nodded. Even the kids who seemed to understand this was real danger, and not a game anymore. We waited in that cellar for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. I could hear the men moving through the cabin above us, opening doors and closets, having conversations in their language that I couldn't understand, but whose tone was clear enough. They were looking for something specific, maybe someone specific, and they weren't in a hurry. At one point I heard them come down to the basement, and my heart stopped completely, but they didn't seem to know about the root cellar because they just moved some boxes around and went back upstairs. Melanie was signing frantically in the dark, and I held up my phone light just enough to see her hands. My fault. Douglas. Witness. Trial. They found us. And suddenly everything clicked into place. Douglas had testified against someone, probably organized crime based on the professional way these men were operating, and someone had tracked them to this isolated cabin where there were no witnesses and no quick police response. We weren't random victims. We were collateral damage in whatever mess Melanie and Douglas had gotten themselves into. I wanted to be furious at them for bringing this danger to our family without warning, but anger wasn't useful when 3 armed men were hunting us 20 feet away. I needed to think strategically, figure out what they'd do next, and how we could survive it. Isaac was signing questions at me in the dark, his ASL sloppy from years of disuse but understandable. What now? Wait? Run? I signed back. They'll burn cabin to flush us out or wait for morning. Need plan. My dad couldn't understand our signed conversation, but he could sense we were communicating, and he held up his own phone with a message. Old hunting trail behind cabin leads to logging road. 2 miles through forest. Could reach town if we move fast. I typed back. They'll hear us leaving. Need distraction. That's when Owen, Melanie's 7-year-old son, started signing to me. I hadn't known he could sign at all, but apparently Melanie had taught him some basics, and he was gesturing frantically in the phone light. I can be loud, run different way, they chase me, you run real way. The suggestion came from a 7-year-old, and it was absolutely out of the question because I wasn't going to let a child sacrifice himself as a distraction. But it gave me an idea. If we could create noise in one direction while the family escaped in another direction, we might have a chance. The cabin had a generator in a shed about 50 yards from the back door, and if I could get to it and start it up, the sudden sound might draw the intruders outside to investigate, while everyone else made a run for the hunting trail on the opposite side of the property. It was risky, because I'd be exposed and alone, but I'd grown up in these woods and knew the terrain better than anyone. I could start the generator and disappear into the trees before they reached the shed, then circle back to meet the family at the logging road. I typed this plan out and passed my phone around the cellar, and everyone read it with expressions that ranged from terrified to reluctantly accepting that it was our best option. My dad signed no, even though he didn't know ASL, just shook his head violently and tried to take my phone to type a response, but I'd already made up my mind. Isaac signed at me. Too dangerous. I'll do it. You stay with family. But I signed back something I'd never really articulated before. This is what I trained for. All those years. Every language. Every sign. It was preparing me to save you without sound. This is why it mattered. Isaac's face crumpled, and he grabbed my shoulder, squeezing hard, and I knew he understood that I was right. I was the only one who could move silently enough, who could communicate the plan to everyone without making sound, who had spent 2 decades developing exactly the skills we needed for this specific nightmare. I gave everyone final instructions using a combination of signs and typed messages. Wait 5 minutes after I leave. When you hear generator start, move fast to hunting trail. Don't stop for anything. Douglas knows where logging road meets highway. Flag down any car. Get police. I'll meet you there. Before I left the cellar, I did something that surprised me. I hugged each family member, even Melanie, who'd caused this whole situation, even Douglas, who I barely knew, because I realized that despite all my complaints about them dismissing my passion and calling me weird and treating my sign languages like a useless hobby, I loved them completely, and I'd do anything to keep them alive. My mom was crying harder now, and she grabbed my face and whispered so quietly I could barely hear it, I'm sorry we never learned to sign. I'm sorry we didn't understand. I signed back, knowing she wouldn't understand the words, but hoping she'd understand the meaning. You're about to watch it save your lives. That's understanding enough. Then I opened the root cellar door and slipped out into the basement darkness, moving toward the stairs that led up to the main floor where 3 armed men were still searching for my family. I could hear them talking in the living room, their voices casual, like they had all the time in the world. I moved up the basement stairs one at a time, testing each step before putting my full weight down, avoiding the 3rd and 7th steps that I knew creaked from childhood experience. The basement door was still slightly open from when the men had checked it earlier, and I could see through the gap into the hallway. One man was sitting on the couch with a rifle across his lap, looking at his phone even though there was no signal. He was young, maybe 25, with a shaved head and a tattoo on his neck that looked Eastern European in style. The other 2 were somewhere else in the cabin, probably still checking rooms or maybe watching the exits. I needed to get from the basement to the back door without being seen, which meant crossing about 15 feet of open hallway in direct line of sight of the man on the couch. This was impossible, unless I could time it perfectly to the moment when his attention was elsewhere. I watched him for 2 minutes, barely breathing, studying his pattern of movement. He kept looking at his phone, then up at the hallway, then back to his phone in a rhythm that was almost predictable. He'd look down for about 7 seconds at a time, before glancing up to check his surroundings. 7 seconds wasn't enough to cross the hallway, but it was enough to make it to the kitchen doorway, and from there I could use the kitchen island as cover to reach the back door. I waited for the next phone-checking cycle and moved the instant his eyes dropped. 3 steps fast and silent, and I was pressed against the kitchen doorway, heart exploding in my chest, expecting any second to hear him shout or raise his rifle, but no sound came. I waited for his next phone check and moved again, sliding behind the kitchen island, then to the counter, then to the back door that was hanging slightly open from when they'd broken in. I could see the generator shed from here, maybe 50 yards across open snow that would show my footprints clearly, but couldn't be helped. I went through the door and into the night, and the cold hit me like a physical thing because I was only wearing the t-shirt and sweatpants I'd been sleeping in. The snow was 6 inches deep, and my feet went numb almost immediately, but I ran toward the shed in a crouch, trying to move fast while staying low. Behind me, I heard one of the men say something in Russian and another respond, and I thought they'd spotted me, but they were just having a normal conversation. I reached the shed and pulled open the door, and the generator was right there covered in cobwebs and oil stains. My dad had shown me how to start it years ago, and I prayed I remembered the sequence correctly, because I'd only have one chance at this. I primed the fuel line, checked the oil level, and pulled the starter cord as hard as I could. Nothing happened. The generator coughed, but didn't catch, and I felt panic rising because if this didn't work, then I'd exposed myself for nothing. I adjusted the choke and pulled again, putting everything I had into it, and this time the generator roared to life with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet forest. Lights flickered on in the cabin as the electrical system came back online, and I didn't wait to see the reaction because I was already running. I ran away from the cabin toward the tree line, angling north instead of south where my family would be heading, and behind me I heard shouting in Russian and the back door slamming open. I crashed into the forest and kept running, branches whipping my face and arms, my feet screaming with pain from the cold and the rocks hidden under snow. I could hear someone chasing me, boots crunching through snow, getting closer. A gunshot cracked through the air, and I felt bark explode off a tree next to my head. I zigzagged and kept running, using every piece of childhood knowledge about these woods to find the paths that would slow down someone who didn't know the terrain. I ran for maybe 10 minutes before I was sure I'd lost whoever had been chasing me. My lungs were burning, and my feet had gone from painful to numb to not feeling like they belonged to me anymore. I stopped behind a massive fallen tree and tried to catch my breath, listening for sounds of pursuit. Nothing except wind in the trees and my own ragged breathing. I'd done it. I'd created the distraction and gotten away, and now my family should be well on their way to the hunting trail and the logging road beyond. I just needed to circle back, staying wide to avoid the cabin, and meet them at the highway. But when I tried to stand up, my legs wouldn't cooperate properly. The cold had gotten deeper than I'd realized, and I was starting to shiver violently in a way that I knew from wilderness training was the beginning of hypothermia. I needed to move, needed to generate heat, but my body was shutting down from the combination of adrenaline crash and exposure. I forced myself to stand and started walking south, trying to remember the layout of the forest from childhood expeditions with my dad. If I could find the creek that ran parallel to the hunting trail, I could follow it down to the logging road, but everything looked different at night, covered in snow, and I was having trouble focusing on landmarks. My thoughts were getting fuzzy around the edges in a way that scared me more than the armed men did, because I knew what happened to people who got lost in the Cascade Mountains in November. They found your body in the spring, if they found you at all. I walked for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes before I saw flashlight beams cutting through the trees ahead of me. My first thought was that the men from the cabin had found me, but then I heard my dad's voice calling my name, and I wanted to cry with relief. I stumbled toward the voices and found my entire family clustered together on the hunting trail, looking frozen and terrified, but alive. Isaac reached me first and wrapped his jacket around my shoulders, and I realized I was shaking so hard I could barely stand. My mom was crying and trying to check if I was hurt, and even Melanie looked relieved to see me, even though she still had that expression of guilty horror that told me she understood this was her fault. Douglas was carrying Owen on his back, and Lily was holding Natasha's hand, both kids looking traumatized but staying quiet like they'd been taught. My dad signed something that wasn't real ASL, just a gesture that clearly meant, hurry, and we started moving down the trail together. I was having trouble walking straight, and Isaac ended up supporting most of my weight, half carrying me through the snow while I tried to force my numb legs to keep functioning. The logging road was farther than I'd remembered, and we walked for almost an hour before we reached it. By then, the sky was starting to lighten with pre-dawn gray, and I could see the exhaustion and fear on everyone's faces. The road was empty, nobody around for miles, and we started walking toward where it intersected with the highway. My feet had moved beyond pain into complete numbness, and I knew I'd probably have frostbite damage, but I couldn't think about that now. We walked for maybe 20 minutes on the logging road before we saw headlights approaching from behind us. Everyone tensed, ready to run back into the forest, but Douglas recognized the vehicle as a Forest Service truck and started waving his arms. The truck stopped, and a ranger got out, looking confused about why a group of people, including 2 children, were walking down a logging road at dawn in November. My dad explained quickly that armed men had broken into our cabin and we'd escaped through the forest, and the ranger's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. He got on his radio immediately and started calling for police backup and medical assistance, then loaded all of us into his truck. The drive to town took 40 minutes, and during that time, I watched Melanie finally break down and tell my parents everything. Douglas had witnessed a murder committed by a Ukrainian organized crime syndicate in Seattle 6 months ago. He'd testified in federal court, and the main defendant had been convicted, but apparently the organization had resources and connections that made witness protection insufficient. They'd tracked Douglas and Melanie somehow, found out about the family cabin, and sent a team to eliminate the witness and anyone who might have information. Melanie was sobbing as she explained that she'd thought coming to the cabin would be safer than staying in the city, that she'd never imagined they'd be found in such an isolated location. My mom looked devastated hearing this, not just from the danger, but from the realization that Melanie had brought it to our doorstep without warning. My dad was quiet in a way that suggested he was too angry to speak yet, too focused on getting everyone to safety to address what this betrayal meant. I was too exhausted and hypothermic to have strong feelings about anything, just numb inside and outside. The ranger drove us straight to a hospital in Oak Ridge, where police were waiting along with FBI agents who specialized in organized crime cases. They separated us for interviews, and I spent 3 hours telling my story to a detective while a doctor worked on my feet. The frostbite wasn't as bad as I'd feared, mostly superficial tissue damage that would heal with time, but they wanted to keep me overnight for observation. Isaac stayed with me while the rest of the family was processed through various interviews and medical checks. The FBI told us later that day that they'd raided the cabin and found the 3 men still there, apparently waiting for dawn to continue their search. All 3 were arrested without incident and identified as enforcers for a Ukrainian crime organization with connections throughout the Pacific Northwest. The main defendant from Douglas's trial had allegedly ordered the hit from prison, using smuggled communications to coordinate with outside operatives. The FBI said our escape had been remarkable, that most civilian families in similar situations didn't survive, and they wanted to understand how we'd managed to evade 3 professional killers in such a confined space. When I explained about the sign languages and how I'd been able to coordinate everyone silently, the lead agent just stared at me for a long moment before saying, That was the most unusual survival skill he'd encountered in 20 years of law enforcement. The story hit the news within a week because someone at the FBI leaked details to a reporter, and suddenly, I was getting interview requests from local stations and then national media. Everyone wanted to hear about the man who'd learned sign languages as a kid and used them to save his family from organized crime hitmen. The angle was perfect for viral content, the weird hobby that turned out to be crucial, the underdog using his dismissed skills to become a hero. I did a few interviews mostly because the FBI thought public pressure would help keep my family safe by making us high-profile victims that the crime organization couldn't easily target again. During these interviews, I talked about my childhood obsession with sign languages, my years of practice that everyone had told me were wasted, and how it felt to finally have validation that those years had mattered. But I tried to be honest that it was also luck, that I'd happened to have exactly the right skill at exactly the right moment, and other families wouldn't have that advantage. The attention was overwhelming and strange. People I hadn't spoken to in years were suddenly reaching out to congratulate me, or ask for interviews, or tell me they'd always known my hobby would be important someday. Online communities of signers were treating me like some kind of celebrity, sharing my story and using it as evidence that sign languages deserved more respect and recognition. Deaf activists reached out to thank me for bringing attention to their languages, though some also correctly pointed out that the story was really about me as a hearing person, rather than about deaf culture itself. I tried to be thoughtful about this, acknowledging that I'd learned these languages as an outsider and my experience didn't represent the deaf community's actual struggles or perspectives. The whole thing made me uncomfortable because I hadn't saved my family to prove a point about sign languages being valuable. I'd done it because they were my family, and I happened to have a skill that helped in that specific crisis. My relationship with each family member shifted after that week, in ways both obvious and subtle. Isaac and I became closer than we'd ever been, bound by the shared experience of thinking we might die together in that forest. He started actually learning ASL properly, taking online classes and practicing with me over video calls, saying he never wanted to be unable to communicate silently again if another crisis happened. Natasha broke off their engagement about a month later, saying she couldn't handle the trauma of what had happened and needed to step back from the relationship. Isaac took it hard, but understood, and we spent a lot of time together during his recovery period. My parents apologized for dismissing my sign language obsession for so many years, my mom especially tearful when she said she'd never realized how wrong she'd been to treat it as a childish phase. I told them it was okay, that I'd never needed their validation to keep practicing, but I appreciated the acknowledgement now. Melanie was the hardest relationship to rebuild, because the betrayal of bringing danger to our family without warning had created a wound that wouldn't heal quickly. She'd apologized dozens of times, explained that she'd genuinely thought the cabin would be safer than the city, that she'd never imagined the crime organization could track them to such an isolated location. Douglas had been in FBI protective custody and was preparing to testify in additional trials against other organization members, meaning Melanie and the kids would be in witness protection for the foreseeable future. We wouldn't be able to see them or contact them once they disappeared into new identities, which added another layer of grief to everything that had happened. The last time I saw Melanie before she entered witness protection, she hugged me for a long time and signed, "I'm sorry," over and over, her ASL clumsy but earnest. I signed back, "I forgive you," and I meant it, even though part of me was still angry about what her choices had cost our family. The cabin was destroyed in the FBI raid, something about evidence collection and crime scene processing that made it uninhabitable. My parents decided not to rebuild, saying the place held too many terrible memories now, and they'd rather invest in something new somewhere else. I understood, even though I felt sad about losing that connection to my childhood. The Forest Service eventually bought the land, and it's protected wilderness now, which seems like the right ending for that particular chapter. Life slowly returned to something approximating normal over the following months, though none of us were quite the same people we'd been before. I still practiced sign languages every day, but now there was a weight to it, an awareness that these skills I'd developed for personal satisfaction had literally saved lives and might need to do so again someday. I started teaching sign language classes at a community center in Portland, working with both hearing students who wanted to learn and deaf community members who helped me understand the cultural contexts I'd always approached as an outsider. It felt like the right way to honor what those languages had given me, passing on the knowledge to others who might find their own reasons for valuing it. Some of my students were there because they'd heard my story and wanted to learn practical skills for emergency situations, which always made me slightly uncomfortable because I didn't want to position sign languages primarily as survival tools rather than as rich linguistic systems with their own cultural significance. But I understood the impulse to learn skills that might matter in a crisis, having spent 23 years developing exactly that kind of skill without knowing it would ever be necessary. My dating life improved somewhat after the news coverage, women apparently finding my story interesting enough to overlook my still strange dedication to hand shapes and visual communication. I went on a few dates with a deaf woman named Kayla, who I met through the community center, and for the first time I experienced what it was like to communicate primarily in sign with someone who'd grown up in that linguistic space. It was humbling because even after all my years of practice, I was still clearly an outsider to deaf culture and ASL, still making mistakes and showing gaps in my understanding. Kayla was patient with me, correcting my signs and helping me understand the deeper cultural meanings I'd missed by learning these languages academically rather than immersively. We dated for about 4 months before mutually deciding we were better as friends than romantic partners, but that relationship taught me more about deaf culture and ASL than years of independent study had. I finally understood what people meant when they said sign languages were living languages embedded in communities and histories, not just interesting technical systems to be mastered by hearing people looking for unusual hobbies. Looking back now, almost a year after that Thanksgiving week, I still don't know how to feel about the whole experience. Part of me is grateful that my obsession turned out to have real-world value, that all those years of practice weren't wasted, even if that validation came through trauma. Part of me wishes it had never been tested in such a horrifying way, that my family could have stayed safe, and I could have continued practicing sign languages as a harmless hobby, without the weight of knowing these skills had been life or death crucial. I think about alternate versions of that week, where I hadn't spent my childhood learning to communicate silently, where I'd yelled instead of signing and gotten everyone killed, where the armed men had found us in that root cellar, and everything ended differently. Those alternate timelines haunt me sometimes when I'm trying to sleep. The knowledge that everything could have gone so much worse, and we survived partly through skill, but mostly through luck. The question I get asked most in interviews and by people who hear my story is whether I think sign languages should be more widely taught as practical emergency skills. My answer is always complicated because yes, obviously the ability to communicate silently had value in my specific crisis, but reducing these rich languages to just emergency tools feels disrespectful to the deaf communities who created and maintain them. I try to encourage people to learn sign languages for the right reasons, to genuinely engage with deaf culture and understand these as complete linguistic systems with their own grammar and cultural significance, not just as potential survival tricks. But I also can't deny that in the specific moment when my family needed to coordinate our escape without making sound, having spent 23 years obsessively practicing various sign languages gave me exactly the tools necessary to save our lives. Sometimes practical value and deeper meaning can coexist, and maybe that's okay. Isaac calls me at least once a week now, and we have long conversations entirely in ASL over video chat where he practices his improving skills, and I feel closer to him than I have since childhood. He started dating again and seems genuinely okay after everything that happened with Natasha. My parents ask me to teach them basic signing, saying they want to be able to communicate with me in my preferred language, and I've been giving them simple lessons during our monthly dinners. They're terrible at it. Their hand shapes clumsy and their facial expressions all wrong, but the effort means more to me than decades of perfect grammar would have. They're trying to understand a part of me they'd dismissed for most of my life, and that feels like healing in progress. I don't know if we'll ever fully recover from that week as a family, if the fear and betrayal and trauma will ever completely fade, but we're trying. The last thing I'll say is this: if you have a weird hobby or obsession that other people dismiss as pointless, don't let their judgment stop you from pursuing what genuinely interests you. You never know when your unusual skills might turn out to matter in ways nobody could have predicted. I spent 23 years being called weird and told I was wasting my time, and then one week in November, those dismissed skills became the difference between my family living and dying. That doesn't mean every hobby will have dramatic real-world applications, or that you should only pursue interests that might someday prove useful. Sometimes things matter just because they bring you joy, or help you understand the world differently. But it's worth remembering that value isn't always obvious until you need it. and the path from childhood obsession to life-saving skill can be stranger than anyone imagines. I learned sign languages as a kid for fun, never expecting them to matter beyond personal satisfaction. It turned out to be the only reason my family is still alive. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.